I appreciate the Louisville Free Public Library inviting me to give a presentation this evening. It is National Historic Preservation Month, so as you might imagine, at the State Historic Preservation Office, we've been very busy. But this is exactly the kind of thing that we like to do, is to get out, talk to folks, sort of remind people why we do what we do, what incentives and tools are available out there so that you can also get involved, working either with our office at the state level or working with all the wonderful local organizations that are in your community. So let's go ahead and get started. So the power of historic preservation, you're gonna see a theme throughout my discussion tonight, of which the power is really people. That's really what it comes down to. There are tools, there are incentives, there are things that really make the difference in terms of how preservation projects can go forward, but it's really about people. Preservation is about people. So it was mentioned, I'm the director of the Kentucky Heritage Council. We are the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state and territory in the country has one of them. And the reason that we exist is because federal law requires us to exist. We have a number of roles and responsibilities that fall under federal law, namely the National Historic Preservation Act. But we do quite a bit that goes beyond our federal mandate. As a result, most of our funding comes from the National Park Service. So I like to point out that we're a very good value for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And none of the federal funds we receive are taxpayer funds. They all come from the lease of Outer Continental Shelf oil reserves. So yeah, we're not supported by taxpayer dollars at the federal level.
Sorry, that's me. I'm the supervisor interview tonight, so it might go off.
Okay, so kind of to stay in line with the flyer, I didn't know what the group would be like tonight. I didn't know if it would be a bunch of familiar faces, and there are a few in here, or if it would be a group of folks who are brand new to preservation. But for those who I don't know who are either practicing preservationists or professional preservationists, can you raise your hand? Okay. And of course, I know you guys are. So for those who are owners of historic homes?
How about renters?
Renters, that works. So something drew you to that neighborhood and to that place that you rented. It was probably the historic authenticity of it. And for the others, just interested in historic preservation and what it's all about. Well, that's good, because most of what I'm talking about is geared towards you. So for these other folks, this will probably be a refresher at best. No, they probably won't do that. So the first question is, so what comes to mind when you think of Louisville? I mean, what would make Louisville less Louisville if you got rid of it? I mean, any general thoughts, things that come to mind?
The thing on your photo.
Church hounds.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. That's fine. Well, the other question too, maybe that's an easier one. What makes you proud to live here? What keeps you here? Why don't you leave for St. Louis or for Lexington or for Columbus, Ohio? What keeps you in Louisville, Kentucky? Neighborhoods. Culture. You know I'm going to put you on the spot. So.
Cost of living, man. It's
Hey, that's very
affordable. Yeah, for what it is.
No, that's fair. So here's just a few things that I put together just to sort of tease out the idea generally. So neighborhoods, that's a big part of it. You become kind of associated with, you identify with the neighborhood. That's kind of makes it home for you. But there are also these iconic places and these hometown heroes that you associate with place. You know, whether it's the Big Four Bridge, or whether it's Muhammad Ali, or whether it's the people. If you're in Louisville because of the people, all of those things are important, and all of those things factor into historic preservation because it's about place, and people are a part of it. So we're going to be talking just a little bit more about that idea. When you're talking about place, and you're talking about people and the diverse history associated with communities as large as this one, if you're looking at Louisville as a whole, there is a lot of stories to tell. There is a lot of history that's been made over the course of decades and decades. We haven't always been so good at telling our full Kentucky story, and we're trying to do better all the time. We still have a long way to go, but both Louisville's diverse history and Kentucky's diverse history, that's what we're interested in. And the public side of that is engaging with average citizens who care about their surroundings, their quality of life, and those things that make home home. So this gives you a little idea about our mission. This is actually in statute. We are the only state agency that really does this. We're a small agency. We have about 26 staff members. Almost every staff member has a program that they administer. But we're the only ones that are really doing this, fully focused on the preservation and protection of meaningful vestiges of Kentucky's heritage, to pass along for future generations, to enjoy today and to pass along for future generations. And that includes things like buildings and structures and sites, and archaeological resources, natural, military, political. All of these things are dealt with by our agency at one point or another in our work. Some of the things that we engage in, we administer multiple state commissions, including the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission, the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission, Martin Luther King Jr. State Commission, the Heritage Battlefield Commission, Military Heritage Commission. Yes, we have a lot of commissions. But what's so great about that is it gives us an opportunity to interact with all of these diverse individuals throughout the state who understand their history a lot better than we do. And so this is a connection point. Education, we're out in the schools quite a bit, working with teachers to teach students about historic preservation and public history. At the end of the day, preservation is kind of public history. Kentucky Archaeology Month, we have the statewide archaeology conference hosted by our agency. But we also do promotions, and we work with nonprofits, and we work with for-profit developers. They're all in the mix in terms of getting positive preservation accomplished. So a few more things to think about. This is our sort of aspirational goals. Is again, we're interested in the natural in addition to the historical culture. Most folks just think we're concerned about the historic elements, but the environmental elements are important too. And we factor into federal laws like NEPA, not directly, but indirectly. We're also very concerned about new construction. Because whether that's new construction that's repairing an existing historic environment that's had losses, or whether that's properly balancing your community with new development and historic preservation, that's something we take keen interest in. We often say that if a community is all about new development and they don't care about their existing resources, they're out of balance, the opposite is probably going to be true too. New development is not a bad thing if it's done correctly and if it's helping to also repair the existing environment. We're always looking for new opportunities to reach people. I think this is a case in point. We do have some new folks in here, which is great. And stop me at any time, by the way, for anyone that I don't know. If you have a question about what I'm talking about, or catch me afterwards. We're looking for opportunities to make new connections. A preservation ethics statewide. Some communities have a great preservation ethic, and it usually shows in their built environment. Some have awful preservation ethics. I won't name the town, but the one that my wife grew up in here in Kentucky destroyed their entire downtown, and now it has a CVS and McDonald's, and that is their identity as a community now. So and you see everything in between those two things. But having a preservation ethic starts with the citizen. Every Kentuckian benefits from this. You don't have to go far here in Louisville to see that. We encourage people to get involved, to actually do something about it, and not just complain when you see a problem, but get involved and work towards making a difference. And we strive to be the voice for the resource. These resources can't speak for themselves. There are plenty of voices for new construction. Folks that want a new Walmart, folks that are developing the big apartment complex somewhere, lots of people supporting them. There aren't as many voices for historic preservation. You have local nonprofits, vital sites, you have the Louisville Historical League, you have others. But from a state perspective, we try and be that voice for the resource and work with and support those local organizations. Okay, so again, public policy is really important, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, both federal, state, and local preservation policy. But at the end of the day, it's citizen-driven. Without the citizens fighting for this stuff, we wouldn't have public policy. Quick primer, where did this all come from? There was historic preservation, obviously, before the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. But the famous story is Louisa Bird Cunningham was going down the Potomac, and she looked over and saw George Washington's house falling into disrepair. And after a little bit of work trying to convince people that, oh, we need to save this property, she wasn't getting anywhere. She called her daughter, and Pamela Cunningham, and said, what the men of the United States refuse to do, the women must step up and do. It's paraphrase, that's not exactly. And this kind of started a preservation movement in that before this it wasn't really there wasn't a model, and they created a model through fundraising, through getting activists to join in with them to physically preserve this. So when Louisa Cunningham first saw this in 1853, just 7 years later they had purchased the property and started on the rehabilitation. And without their efforts, it probably would have been lost. It also established this idea that the matriarchs in our field hold a very special place for us. It was the women of our country who started the preservation movement, not the men. And you often see throughout our history of preservation, it's women who are playing those leadership roles, including Kentucky's first state historic preservation officer, Ida Willis, for whom our annual awards are proclaimed. So these are the ladies. They would not be deterred. They raised $200,000 in the mid to late 19th century, which translates to $5.7 million today. So pretty impressive. You flash forward 100 years to the 1960s, and you have some really significant things that happen. You have urban renewal. You have the Interstate Highway Act, and you have the loss of some really kind of seminal buildings for people, where there was a visceral reaction to it. The big one was Penn Station in New York, built in 1910, designed by McKinley and White. Fantastic Mozart structure, large, imposing. Ridership was down. Cars were starting to kind of take over things, ridership was down. They didn't want to maintain it anymore. They said, let's level it. Instead, we'll build Madison Square Garden. Huge outcry. Jackie Kennedy even got involved and marched. But it got the attention not only of New York politicians, but also of national politicians. This led to a landmarks ordinance in New York, which was kind of a model for a lot of other larger cities later on, including Louisville. But it led to something occurring at the national level, which is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. As part of that, a number of things were put into place to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen with impunity. We can see the effects of this type of development in Louisville, right? The idea was we can clear slum and blight just by putting our interstate highway through it, quick and easy. We can just take down entire blocks of historic buildings, and we can build something that people at the time would see as contemporary and attractive. Maybe something brutalist, maybe something stark and clean. And I love this picture. I had a meeting at the Housing Authority here in Louisville, and they had this on their wall. And so I stopped and took a picture of the picture. But this is actually a picture of the first house in West Louisville getting torn down for urban renewal. Maybe not the very first, but it's the photo op. And this had a huge impact on these lower income neighborhoods. This was seen as an opportunity to clear slum and blight, and the effects were really kind of disastrous. Here's Walnut Street, between 6th and 13th Street. That was the black commercial district, and it was thriving. You take the combination of desegregation and urban renewal, and this starts to go downhill quickly. And so the generational wealth that African Americans had developed, those business relationships, sort of fell to the wayside. You start seeing massive demolitions and the slow destruction of the West End. But these are connected with many times federal actions. And so the National Historic Preservation Act was put into place specifically to curb some of this, at least force them to listen to the local community. And so this is the basic gist of it. But the important points to pull out is that these historic places should be preserved as a living part of community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation, to know where we came from, to understand that we are not here in isolation, that we are the product of many, many years of investment in community. The other one that's so important is that, the other piece, is that the preservation of this irreplaceable heritage is in the public interest. So this is the first time that the federal government ever said, it is in our national interest to not throw everything away. And thank goodness, because you wouldn't even realize it. Some of those places that you said, or maybe you thought about when I asked what's important about this community, what keeps you here, there's a good chance that those things were threatened at one point or another with demolition, insensitive alteration, or all manner of other impacts that the National Historic Preservation Act is a big part of why it's still on the landscape, either directly or indirectly by supporting the development of an ethic and groups that can work to inform the citizenry and work to put these places back into functional use. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and resources. So these are some of the organizations that I would consider a resource for you. In addition to the State Historic Preservation Office, you have the National Organization of State Historic Preservation Officers. We're constantly fighting to ensure that the National Historic Preservation Act doesn't get gutted, and that there's proper funding for us to be able to continue doing this important work. Tribal historic preservation offices are very, very important as well. Kentucky has, I mentioned, a Native American Heritage Commission, and the interest of NAPCO and our organization isn't just on the resources, the archaeological resources, but also on the culture, on language, and many, many other things. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is the federal agency in charge of ensuring that the regulatory side of the National Historic Preservation Act is properly implemented. So we review over 4,000 federal projects a year to make sure those projects are not unnecessarily impacting significant resources, either historic buildings or archaeological sites. It might surprise you, sometimes we don't agree with the federal agency. When we don't agree with the federal agency, the ACHP is sort of the tiebreaker in terms of interpreting federal law and how it applies to a specific project.
Well, what's for example?
What's an example? Well, we dealt with one very recently where there was an applicant who was given a $400 million grant from the Department of Energy, and they went out in advance of doing archaeological survey and they blitzed everything. So they clear-cut everything. So if there was any intact archaeology there, it would have been destroyed by the time it got to our office. So, okay, this is a huge problem. You're going to have to, at the very least, mitigate it, make up for it. The federal agency disagreed. They're like, nope, there were no historic resources when we got there. So we went back and forth for probably 6 months, and then it went to the ACHP. They agreed with us, and the Department of Energy still said, well, we're finished with our consultation. Thank you, but no thank you. So even the ACHP can't trump final decision making, but that's just one example. We get into those issues often, but usually we can work them out. We have to give a little bit, the federal agency gives a little bit, and we find something that makes sense. And I should mention, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but that regulatory review process includes an opportunity for citizens to be at the table. They're called consulting parties. All they have to do is illustrate they have a vested interest in the project, and you get to receive everything that we get to receive for review as a state agency. So the National Historic Preservation Act lays that out. And the big reasons for what I mentioned is because of what I mentioned earlier, which is Federal Highway Administration, Housing and Urban Development, these big federal agencies were coming through and leveling neighborhoods without talking to anyone. Eminent domain, demolition. And so that public component is so critical. When there are no other consulting parties, they have to implement us. So the resource will always have someone at the table sort of advocating on their behalf. So this is what we look like. We're basically broken up into 4 sections. In addition to our administrative section, site identification, site protection, site development, and the Kentucky Main Street program. Kentucky has the oldest statewide Main Street program in the country, and I always argue it's the reason our small downtowns look better than anybody else's is because we've been doing it long. But in all caps there, the big point is to save the irreplaceable. These are endangered species. Historic resources are endangered species. When they're gone forever. You can't bring them back. So, Steve mentioned Whiskey Road earlier. This one, this is a good example of a downtown preservation project. For those who remember, this one was on the chopping block. 11th hour, it was almost gone. And now, I don't think anybody could imagine Louisville without Whiskey Road. We care about small towns, those rural places out in the state. These were the hearts of these communities. And when they dry up and they're not invested in, and they don't have anything going on, it hurts the entire community. These are great small business incubators. They have visual interest. They tell stories. People coming in from out of town want to see these places. They don't want to see what's happening on the bypass. Unless they need milk and bread in the public water. We care about neighborhoods. Louisville has some of the best residential neighborhoods you're going to find anywhere. I mean, old Louisville kind of being like, oh, like way at the top. But you have all of these other neighborhoods that are just truly amazing. The quirky. We have lots of quirky stuff in Kentucky. We love all of them. In fact, the roadside stuff is probably my favorite area of architecture in this country. Those multi-component sites that are a little more complicated sometimes to deal with. Shaker Village is there on the left. They use our incentives every single year. It's one of the reasons they're able to look as good as they look. Is because they stay on top of maintenance. But functionally related complexes like distilleries. Almost every distillery that's historic in Kentucky has utilized some of the programs that I'll be talking about in a minute. Yeah.
So is Shaker Village a related property?
Related in what?
Like, they could use the tax incentives for each building individually?
Yes.
But on the prior slide, you have like the Wigwam Village. Why can't they use the related sites?
You know
individually?
stuff. Well, so Shaker Village is a nonprofit. They're not eligible to get the federal historic tax credit. This federal tax credit and the state tax credit, the rules are different, a little bit different. I know with Wigwam Village, they were seeking both the state and the federal historic tax credit. And in those instances, we are trumped by the National Park Service, and so we follow their rules. If the National Park Service isn't engaged, they're not involved, we follow the state rules. And the state rules allow us to, for instance, give a tax credit to a nonprofit. The federal government doesn't. So as long as they're spending the minimal threshold on qualified expenditures, then we can give them a tax credit every year when they come through. That last one there is the Abraham Lincoln birthplace. We were just talking about that. We have a close working relationship both with bureaucrats in D.C., the National Park Service, as well as the installations here in Kentucky. We have some fantastic National Park Service sites in state. Our rural resources are truly incredible, world-class. Horse farms, our coal camps, our towns that have that strong coal heritage. Our rock fences are internationally known, and our farms. We have a great variety of farms as you go from east to west. What you find in the east and what you find in the far western parts of the state couldn't be more different. But in the landscape couldn't be more different. We're very diverse in that. And of course, archaeology. And not just prehistoric archaeology, but historic archaeology as well. In some instances, this is the only way we can learn about the individuals who occupied this land. In other instances, that historic archaeology sometimes is the only way that you can hear the voices of people who didn't get their story written. And so it's a very, very important part of what we do under the National Historic Preservation Act. But community engagement, there's so many great things happening around the state that are often happening in places where people want to be. And 9 times out of 10, those places are in historic areas, either a historic neighborhood, a historic downtown, a historic site. And so it's a good opportunity for us to engage with. And sometimes it's an opportunity for us to learn. I'll be the first one to tell you, we don't know everything. In fact, everything we do know is from what we've learned from dealing with others since the 60s. And so one example of that is statewide context that we did for the LGBTQ community. We were the first in the country to have a statewide context in that area, but it gave us an opportunity to engage with people on a hidden history and to start to pull that out. And it helped our survey files, it helped contextually, and now we're better able to service that community as a result. So community engagement is critical to the work. And just a couple examples of engaging with folks. So our site identification program, I kind of joke, is our brain. As an agency, it's where 50 years worth of getting out in the field, finding places, documenting those places, putting them in a database, and eventually getting them in a GIS. Now it's all searchable and publicly accessible, by the way, for free. If anybody wants to go and check out all of the sites that have been identified in the state, you can do that through our website. But this information is critical to identifying places both that still remain and places that have been lost. And the losses are tragic. We've lost some truly incredible places, but at least they're documented again. So within our site identification program, so we administer the National Register of Historic Places for Kentucky. Of course, the survey program, the statewide preservation planning we do out of this program. All of those commissions I talked about earlier, that's in this section. But we also administer the Certified Local Government Program, which is a federal, state, local partnership. We only have 23 CLGs in Kentucky. Louisville is one of them. They were added in 1989. And to be in the program, you have to illustrate you have that preservation ethic we were talking about earlier. So you have to have a historic zoning overlay, or overlays, as the case may be here. You have to have a commission in place. You have to be working to continually identify historic resources within your community. Because ultimately, this is a planning tool. You can't save what you don't know exists. And so Louisville became a CLG because they illustrated that ethic. And as a result, they're eligible to receive federal funds through our agency as pass-through. We pass through 10% of all of our funding to local governments, and Louisville is a big user. They usually have proposals each year that are sizable. One was to survey Portland. That was a recent CLG funding project. I don't want to get too into the weeds with some of the local ordinances, but of course, you have some great preservation districts here. Butchtown, Cherokee Triangle, Clifton, Louisville, Parkland, West Main Street. When you put an overlay on a historic area, you're basically saying, this matters. There's something of significance here that we want to keep around. And we want to let developers and investors know that if they come here, there are rules that protect them from inappropriate things happening around them. Too often you hear people say, I would never buy a place in a historic district because they're going to tell me what to do all the time. I argue the exact opposite is true if you're really thinking about it. That if you're going to build you're going to buy an older property, ideally historic, you would only want to buy in a historic district with a zoning overlay because it keeps your neighbor from demolishing their property, the neighbor across the street from demolishing theirs, and pulling down both the aesthetic and the value of the neighborhood. These are some of the most sought after places to live in all of Louisville, right? Okay, Kentucky Main Street, Louisville's not a Main Street program. They were many, many years ago. I think they outgrew us a little bit. Some of our tools work particularly good for small towns. It could also work for neighborhoods. If you're in a neighborhood where you think of the four-point approach, which looks holistically at how to revitalize a commercial district, if you think that can work in your neighborhood, talk to us. But since 1979, $4 billion has been reinvested back into our downtowns. I don't know the ages of everybody, but I think I may have been the last generation where people said, downtown is dangerous, don't go there, no one invests there. It's changed. Now, my kids, my youngest is 13. If you ask him, what do you think of downtown? That's fun. Downtown's cool, right? When I was his age, no. You were not allowed to go downtown. And so that's happened, you know, in that time, since 79, a little over that. But $4 billion reinvested back into our historic downtowns, meaning that they're vibrant now. And now downtowns are, they've made a full recovery, you know, in a lot of instances, except for those places where they tore down. Site protection. So this is the regulatory side of our agency, where we're reviewing about 4,000 a year. We're reviewing gigantic projects. The Louisville, Southern Indiana, Ohio River Bridges project was almost a career project for me. And then you have small ones like HUD-homes that are getting federal assistance, and everything in between. So if you can think of a federal agency we're reviewing, FAA, FCC, U.S. Army Corps, USDA. If you can think of it, we're reviewing projects to make sure that archaeology and historic buildings are being considered. And then consulting parties is a critical piece of that. I've already mentioned it. Louisville is very proactive in that they have a form that you can fill out to request to be part of a federal undertaking. But the views of the public are critical because, again, the federal agency and their applicant doesn't have all the information, and we don't have all the information. This is not our home. I don't live in Louisville. You all are going to know things that I don't know. And so if you don't participate, things could get missed, or just they would never know. So, so that's one way you can engage. Site development is where our historic rehabilitation tax credit program is administered. So the Auerbacher Mansion, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, pretty significant property. It utilized historic rehabilitation tax credits. I would argue that the numbers probably didn't work. Somebody would have lost money, they couldn't make it. They couldn't justify losing money. But with those incentives, it levels the playing field so that these projects can get done. This is a high-style example. There are tons and tons and tons of normal houses in historic residential neighborhoods that are using the historic tax credit to get repaired. So this is the section that also kind of oversees the implementation of the Secretary of the Interior standards. So those standards are basically guardrails for how to treat a historic property. Maintaining historic character, maintaining those historic materials, repairing instead of replacing when possible. Those guardrails are applied to pretty much everything we do. And then, of course, we have easements on more than 100 properties statewide that we inspect, write reports on, and occasionally have to take the property owners to court on. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. But that is probably the best tool in the toolbox because it gives us partial ownership. Federal and state tax credits, over $65 billion nationwide, 38,000 historic properties since it was first implemented in '76. So since 2005, that's when the state program was implemented. The state program obviously came much later than the federal program. 1,258 buildings in Kentucky have been rehabbed using that incentive, and $782 million reinvested. So this is moving the needle.
How much does that compare to other states?
We consistently rank in the top 10 of all states in use of the federal tax credit. And part of the reason is because our state incentive helps to incent larger projects. And so, on the state side, you can get up to $10 million for one project. So the federal is uncapped. So, if you're going to spend $50 million to take on a project, a building that's huge and in awful shape,
and you can also get a $10 million state credit on top of the federal, all of a sudden, your numbers look better. You're coming to Kentucky instead of Ohio, Tennessee. Tennessee doesn't have a state credit, so we steal all their money. It's great. But these are the kind of projects that are getting done. I mean, the Henry Clay is iconic. Yeah.
And the other thing is that you have a very thorough National Register inventory. It always can be added to, but you've built a huge inventory that allows the credit to be functional.
Yeah, and so Kentucky has the 5th highest number of National Register listings in the country. People are often surprised by that. Bigger than Texas, Kentucky. The benefit to that, not only is that honorific, right, but it means that more Kentucky properties are eligible for these incentives because you have to be listed to get it. And so, yeah, we benefit from the early work, my predecessors and staff, who worked so hard to get all these listings in place. So we're very, very proud of our program. This relates directly to you all. So we have at the state level alone, this doesn't even include the federal, we have $100 million available in state tax credits. So the legislature designed it where 75%, 75 million, goes to commercial projects. 25 million goes to residential projects. Last year we had 110 million in requests from the commercial side alone. On the residential side, we had 6 million. So, and we can't switch, at least not yet. They're on separate tracks. So that means $19 million went unused last year. So we're on the warpath. We want people to know that there is significant tax credits available for homeowners to rehabilitate historic properties in Louisville. You should take advantage of it. We want this money to get used. If it doesn't get used, we're scared to death that it could be taken away. We know the need is there. It's a matter of marketing. It's a matter of getting the word out so people know it's not scary. It's not that hard to qualify for it. We will work with you every step of the way. But if you have a historic building listed, say, in a National Register district, and you're planning to do $20,000 worth of work, which a roof can cost $20,000, talk to us. We have some financial help available. It maybe results in you being able to repair your windows too, because of when you add the incentive. So usually the tax credit means more preservation of the work gets done. And this is a great example. This is the Lewis Wolf building in Georgetown. I absolutely love this. No one even thought it was a historic building at first. And so as all this stuff started getting taken off, it's like there is an incredible historic building under there. And now it's one of the prettiest buildings in the entire downtown. This was a tax credit project. So to apply for the credit, qualify for the credit, you have to list on the register. You have to make a substantial investment. For homeowners, it's $20,000. For commercial entities, you have to meet what's called an adjusted basis. You have to spend more on the building than the building is worth, minus the value. But if the building without the land is worth $100,000, you have to spend at least $100,001 to qualify for the commercial program. And you must follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for those guideposts when you're doing the project. And that is done through a consultation. There are forms that are submitted in a consultation to make sure that the integrity of the property is being preserved through the project. And I do like to mention with some of these larger historic properties, you think, wow, $10 million state credit, that's a lot. But in a lot of instances, these projects simply don't go forward without it. And so they sit there, continuing to be a financial and visual drain on their communities. This incentive pays itself back in 4 years. Okay, now I'm getting on my speech to the legislature. This incentive pays itself back in 4 years. So I'd say it's a pretty good investment for not only putting a building back on tax rolls, but turning it into a catalyst to get other rehab happening on neighboring properties. And then with the increased tax revenue, it pays itself off in 4 years. It's a win across the board. Preservation is economic development. It's a lot of other things, but it's economic development. It does create jobs, attracts investment. All of these things you see here are good for neighborhoods, they're good for communities, they're good for our state, and they're good for our country. And this is our business. So, how can you get involved? We're almost at the end here. I think I only have one more slide, and if there are any questions, I can take them. But how can you get involved in historic preservation? And here are some ideas. So work with local advocates. We have advocates in this room you can talk with. Familiarize yourself with those local laws and ordinances, the landmarks commission, the overlay, the rules related to that. Become a consulting party in the Section 106 process. You can talk to the City Preservation Office about any projects that are being proposed that you might be concerned about. That's a quick way to get information on that. Utilize the preservation tax credit. We want you to get this money because it's incentivizing historic preservation, and that's what it's there for. Participate in a historic neighborhood group, and if you don't have one, start one. Encourage youth to consider a career in historic preservation. We talk a lot about this. There's so much energy put towards STEM. STEM is wonderful, but we're losing track of the humanities. We need to let young folks know that the history field is a real field, and there are real jobs with good money that are going unfilled. Interact with and support local historic sites. You've got some great ones. Promote and support protection and interpretation of sites that reflect diversity. Look for those opportunities to support racial, socioeconomic, diversity-related sites. Ask your local candidates for local, state, or national office what they think about historic preservation. If the more you care, the more you mention it, the more they'll at least say they care. And if they say they care, then the chance is that they're going to remember that their constituents are interested in this. So take those opportunities, ask those questions, make sure you convey that. Take opportunities to celebrate history, including the progress that's been made to address and learn from difficult history. We often think of some of the challenges that Louisville has had, that our state has had, the country's had, related to difficult history. We've made progress. We haven't gotten to where we need to get to, but I think we should celebrate what we have been able to accomplish so far. Shop at local businesses that invest in our historic neighborhoods, those small mom and pops. They need your business. And it just so happens that when you spend dollars locally, they circulate locally. Those are the same folks that buy the jerseys that go on your kids when they're playing soccer, and it's good to support those who are supporting the neighborhood. History education in our schools, we need support in that area. And be vocal about revitalization and adaptive reuse, while also being conscientious of social and economic considerations. Gentrification is a real issue. We don't want to drive lower income people out of neighborhoods, as a for example. But every neighborhood deserves to be maintained and supported and revitalized. They don't all have to become Airbnbs, right? So this is just a quick kind of overview of how you can get involved. I think that's my last slide. So this is our website. If you want to jot it down, I don't have any handouts or leave behinds for you. I do have a card if you'd like one. But please go to our website. I think you'll be surprised at how much good information is there and how many different programs you can kind of engage with. And there's also all the folks that you can reach out to. Their phone number's right there, our National Register Coordinator, our Survey Coordinator, CLG Coordinator, all those folks will be happy to talk. So, I don't know how I'm doing it.
Very good.
Is that it? Okay. Yeah, so if you have any questions or questions for each other, happy to hear.
I can put a Band-Aid off. I love cemeteries, so I'm interested in what can we do for, do documenting, I think, or like have a program for that, or cemetery preservation. Anything to talk about with that?
So you just asked one of the hardest questions that there is to ask.
Sorry, there's
cemeteries are really challenging for us at the state level. The legislature in previous executive administrations never identified one agency to be in charge of cemeteries. And so what's happened over the years is one agency will be responsible for one part, another agency for another part. So the Kentucky Historical Society had a pretty robust survey database of cemeteries. And we have, for many years now, we have offered workshops on cemetery headstone restoration. But we don't necessarily overlap when it comes to certain questions. So sometimes we'll have a constituent call and say, hey, I'm wondering who's buried in the cemetery. And we say, oh, we probably want to talk to the Historical Society. And then someone will call the Historical Society and say, hey, I need some help with repairing these headstones that have fallen over. There's been vandalism. Or worse, there's been some kind of desecration, which we deal with that law a lot. They say, no, you have to call the area insurance. So in terms of answering your question, both agencies can be helpful. We would both be happy to engage with you on identification and preservation, but it would have to be us and our sister agency.
Also, just to let you know, Louisville does have a cemetery committee with local government.
For the ones that are part of the
You may
Parks
be
Department,
familiar
I believe.
with
Yeah,
that.
that's what
And
I
then
thought.
Jack Coppo, really, I'm not sure if you know Jack, but Jack has visited over 300 cemeteries here in Jefferson County and has pretty much documented them all. I'm not sure if you have. He's taken pretty much all the headstone photographs and all of that. So Jack is our own personal cemetery historian here in Jefferson County, and he's constantly being called upon when a cemetery has an issue or whatever. So if you don't know Jack, he's
So are these documented like in GIS?
he's got a DVD, which I'll get to you,
That'd be great.
but he's got over 300 cemeteries documented. He knows where they're at. You mentioned a cemetery, and he knows exactly who's there, where, and all. Keep telling him to write a book on all this before he goes.
He used to come to the library and talk.
But, well, we're doing talks. We do talks. Well, I'm doing a talk in October on Southwest cemeteries in Southwest Jefferson County, because they have a lot of personal family cemeteries are the hardest thing to deal with. So we're giving a talk on, me and Jack are giving a talk out there in Southwest Jefferson County on those cemeteries. So, but anyways, we do have that resource here, and we just got to get the word out, it sounds like.
Absolutely. That's always a problem.
See, that's good. So already, there's some sharing of information is useful.
And Jack will just find out about it when he views this on YouTube, and he's going to say, oh, don't volunteer me for anything else.
Can you explain what the consulting parties do? Like, when in the building's life cycle would a consulting party convene?
So consulting parties are only convened when there's a federal undertaking. So some federal nexus that has the potential to affect the historic property. So in other words, the classic example is federal agency buys paper clips. That's not an undertaking. So it doesn't have the potential to affect. If they're building a road or they're building a tower or something like that, they have to implement Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. At that point, they have a responsibility to identify consulting parties. That always includes us, but to find others it usually happens through public notices, ads in the paper, you know, reaching out to local organizations. I know in the past, like when we were still Preservation Louisville, you could reach out to them and they say, oh yeah, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, they're all gonna be interested in being a consulting party. And so once that happens, then, and those folks sign up and are approved, then they receive invitations to all the meetings, they receive reports, and they get to come to the meetings and have their voices heard. The main difference between those consulting parties in our agency and maybe the applicant themselves is that they don't have the ability to stop a project from moving forward because they're not required to sign an agreement document. They can sign as a concurring party saying, yes, we agree, but if they don't sign it, it can still move forward. We have to sign it or it can't move forward. Unless they go to the ACHP can sign it and we're out of luck. But that's how that works. Once the agreement document is finished, finalized, the consulting party process is over.
And the Ohio River Bridge has been a gigantic elephant in the room for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, the consulting parties met.
Many
yeah,
consulting parties, including Preservation Louisville, neighborhood groups, river fields.
We with the league, we're constantly being asked to be a consulting party to things.
And sometimes, and that is how it should be. But there are some that you're probably thinking, this one I don't need to be involved in. Not
Exactly, and we turned down a lot of them too.
Yeah, it happens with the tribes a lot too, because the tribes get inundated. If we're getting 4,000, imagine what one tribe is getting because they're getting it from every federal agency all at one time. But, you know, there are going to be certain ones that you're going to have concerns about, you're going to want to be involved in. So, did that
I wanted
answer your
to,
question?
I'm sorry. I wanted to say what a wonderful opportunity the change in the tax credit is for preservation in Kentucky. And the fact that you all have taken a real leadership position in it. And it was going to hit you anyway, but you prepared for it and you have new staff and you have people who are involved in it. But it is clearly the best incentive Kentucky has ever had to support preservation. And the fact that you had $110 million in commercial tax credit applications last year tells you that the development world has paid attention. And that's really critical. That's really critical.
It really is, and I appreciate you saying that. You know, we advocated for lots of years before it finally happened, and we by no means take all the credit for it. It was a coalition of people all rowing in the same direction that made that happen. But we needed the additional staff. We were about to get clobbered. But you could see it, the number I put up there, I think was like $782 million since 2005. It should be noted that about $600 million of that was last year. So that's the kind of investment that incentive is leveraging for Kentucky.
Exactly.
Because there are developers out of state who now are looking at Kentucky when they wouldn't before. In fact, when it first went into place, we got calls from developers who said, I'm looking for big national register list of properties. I don't necessarily care where they're at. Just tell us, if it's the kind of thing I can spend $100 million on, I'm interested in knowing more. We didn't get those kind of calls before.
Well, it's the ability to do the 20% with the 20% federal. You're getting 40% of your costs returned.
Yeah.
I mean, in what other place in the development world can you do that? It's an incredible opportunity, and the residential credit at 30% is an enormous incentive.
I should have mentioned that. The federal and the state commercial incentive is 20% of all of your qualified expenditures coming back. On the residential side, it's 30%. So that is a nice incentive. And the other nice thing about the Kentucky state credit that differs from other states that have it is that ours is reimbursable. So, the year that you earn your credit, you apply to your state taxes. And let's say you have $5,000 in taxes owed, but you have a $40,000 tax credit. They cut you a check for $35,000. Other states, they force you to draw it down over years. But that's one of the stronger aspects of our program. So, you own a historic home, you don't have a whole lot of state tax liability, you're going to probably get money in your pocket.
One of my residential clients is Rockdale.
Is
Rockdale, it'll be on your awards.
Yeah, one of the project award winners for Ida Lee Willis.
Yeah,
That's an amazing project.
one of the original Tyler family farms.
It's very well done. So any other questions? Or?
One more?
Yeah.
Is there any movement to funding technologies or innovations that can make historic tax credits more accessible to regular people? Because
Just-
there's a documentation burden that might be alleviated through technology.
So just your question sort of underscores the fact, because you've done them, right? You're a professional, you've done them, and even you recognize that it's challenging. It
Yes.
can be challenging. I mentioned earlier, it's easy, no problem. I mean, it depends on where you're starting from and what you intend to do. Everything is moving to digital. So now our agency, you really only should be submitting electronically. The National Park Service has gone to all digital as well. So you can fill these things out either in Word format or in PDF, and you can upload your photographs digitally. So those things are easier. The one thing we have a hard time getting right now is that you still have to document what you're doing so that we can determine whether or not it's going to negatively impact the resources part of it. And we can't give an incentive if there's going to be a negative impact. So we have to have enough specificity to sort of tease that out. That said, we've been talking a lot about how do we work with homeowners to better utilize the incentive and make that application process easier. One of the things that I've suggested, and I haven't really gotten anywhere with, is especially some of our